marks at that time, which is where I got started on thinking about task-based learning. I'm also a second language learner myself. I learned English as a second language. I was originally from Brazil. My family moved to Canada when I was quite young, so I had to learn English as a second language. And so that's part of my background that informs my practice now as well. And finally, as Intan mentioned, I'm a writer and a publisher of teaching materials, and in particular ones that employ a task-based approach. And although I try, of course, to keep up with the research as much as possible, my approach to the approach, as it were, is very much a teacherly approach. I'm a practitioner, perhaps more than a researcher, although I am involved in research as well. But that means that it's always a little bit awkward sometimes for me to present on TBLT, because there's really no way around the fact that my main contributions to the field have been my textbooks. And that makes it a little awkward, because when I try to explain sort of what I think is the best practice about how to implement TBLT, I always end up coming back to having to basically show my textbooks, which are commercial in nature. So just before I get too far into the presentation, I wanted to say quite clearly that I'm not here to sell anything to you. Although I am here to sell you on the idea of TBLT. TBLT, I guess the first point I'd like to make, and I'll share my screen now to make things a little easier. Let me just begin here. There we go. And then share. Let's see, is that working? It doesn't seem to be working. Let me try that again. There we go. Ah, there we go. Okay, so I'll begin the presentation basically making the point that, to me, TBLT has always been a very practical approach. I'm not particularly ideologically wedded to the idea, but it's always been a kind of a means to an end, a way of bringing teaching into the classroom in a communicative way. So even though I don't have a very strong ideological stake in TBLT, so to speak, I do take a rather strong position to the approach, which means that I don't subscribe so much to a weaker kind of, weak in quotation marks here, sort of a task-supported approach, for example. I take, if you're familiar with the literature on TBLT, I take more of a position as Michael Long does, which is a strong kind of ideological position on TBLT. So what I'd like to do today is to kind of position that for you in a way that helps in the classroom and helps to make the case for task-based language teaching. So I'll cover three broad areas here, and I hope that the way I do it will be a little bit different from what you may have done in the past. I'm going to begin with, of course, a little bit of a highlight of some of the principles of TBLT. So what is TBLT? Then I'm going to make the point of why TBLT is important and really necessary. And finally, how do we do TBLT? And I hope to introduce a couple of ideas how to do TBLT that may be a little bit different than you might have seen before in some of the literature. So let's begin with what is TBLT? This is an important question, I think, because TBLT is no longer a very new approach. For a while, people have introduced it as the new thing, the new way to do language teaching in the classroom. But it's been around for a while. It's been around for at least 20 years here in Japan as a strong sort of option for the classroom. So it's no longer new. And that's a little bit problematic because what has happened is people have tried it in the classroom context. And in many cases, at least here in Japan, and I know in a few other contexts as well, it hasn't always worked very well. And I feel that the proponents of task-based learning, until quite recently, frankly, haven't done a very good job of explaining to teachers how TBLT is a very practical and workable approach. There's been a lot of research done, and the research can be quite dense. If you have read some of the theory by people such as Peter Stian or Michael Long or Peter Robinson, some of these books, I've got a few here perhaps, you might have come across some of these in your studies, for example. John's Benjamin Press has quite a few of these. It's quite dense reading. There's a lot of theory, a lot of research on things like cognition and task complexity and how tasks are processed in the brain by the student and so on. It's all very interesting and very fruitful research, but it's not always very practical for the classroom. And teachers, and especially teachers who are in master's programs learning to be teachers, often get a bit turned off by the approach because there is such a, it's so intimidating, frankly, some of this research, some of this literature. So I think it's important to kind of simplify it, but not oversimplify it. I think to go back to the basics and to not lose track of the basics of task-based learning. And that's what I kind of hope to do here today. I'm going to avoid referring a lot to the literature and focus on a couple of key points that I think will be helpful. And this is helpful not only to you as a teacher, but also I hope in the future, as you are perhaps explaining the approach to other teachers and to your students as well. So the first important point is that TBLT is a communicative approach, which of course means it gives priority to meaning above language forms practice. Now, the communicative approach has been around even longer than TBLT. And the communicative approach has been criticized in some contexts. In Japan, for example, it has been criticized because it's difficult to implement. So for example, we may all agree that communication in the classroom part of the time is important, but how do we do it? How do we set up communication for the classroom? And perhaps even more importantly, how do we assess it later? TBLT solves many of these problems. And to me, this is what makes TBLT really crucial and really important to language teaching. It helps us not only, of course, gives priority to meaning, but it brings in this idea of the task, okay, as a unit of sequencing and instruction. And this is really important because without having the task as the thing that we look at, the unit of measurement, if you will, what teachers tend to do is they revert back to the other existing sort of model of language instruction, which is using language forms as the unit of sequencing and instruction. So in other words, in the classroom, if you're using a kind of a forms-based approach, a grammar approach, you sequence your lessons by language forms, perhaps, right? Or by vocabulary difficulty, perhaps. Or maybe by notions and functions and things like telling the time or giving directions and so on. So language forms becomes the sequence of instruction, and then of course becomes what gets assessed at the end. What TBLT does, it's very important, is it provides an alternative to that. And the alternative is, instead of using that grammar syllabus, we use the task as a unit of sequencing and instruction. And that's why it's really important to think of the task in TBLT as not the same as the broader meaning of the word task. The word task, of course, in English means anything that you set someone to do, a kind of assignment, right? And it's often used that way by teachers as well. But in TBLT, the task has a very special meaning that it's within the approach. And if we use it as a task, as a unit of sequencing and instruction, it becomes possible to make our lessons and then to assess them afterwards in a way that's principled. And so this is the second important point I'd like you to remember about TBLT. The task is a unit of sequencing and instruction, which of course begs the question of what is the task, and we'll get back to that. And the other really important point that sometimes gets missed, perhaps the third point I'd like you to keep in mind for now, is that tasks, perhaps the best way, one of the best, most important criteria to define tasks is that they have real world-like outcomes, and they must be assessed by these outcomes. Okay? So if we have created these tasks, and I've got a couple of visual examples here in my slide. If you think of these, each of these three things as tasks, we can then think of outcomes as whether those tasks have been reached. So for example, we've got here a man and a woman shaking hands, meeting each other. So a task could be something like greet your colleague, right? Then the outcome becomes, has the person been greeted appropriately, okay? And it's important to keep that focus on the outcome, because if you don't, again, the danger is reverting back to a kind of forms focus. In other words, in the case of something like greeting a coworker, if the focus is not on the greeting itself, then you, as a teacher, we tend to revert back to language forms and assess based on, for example, how correct somebody has said, you know, nice to meet you, and so on, which is less important than the outcome itself, which is the greeting. So these are the important points to keep in mind about TBLT. I'll clarify some of these, all of these, as we go along. But bear in mind that real world-like outcomes are really important. I'll pause here for a moment because I've just realized I don't have my eye on the chat, and I don't know if there are questions coming in or no. Okay.
Not yet, it's okay, you can continue.
Okay. I will give you an opportunity in a few minutes to go into a breakout room. I'd like to set this up as an interactive, of course, workshop. So you'll have an opportunity then to ask some questions. So let me go to the officially defined principles of TBLT. You may know these from Rod Ellis and Shintani, 2014. These are probably the most widely accepted principles of TBLT. They vary a little bit from proponent to proponent of TBLT. But basically, it's as you can see, again, the focus is on meaning, is at the very top, right? This is non-negotiable, if you will. A task must have a primary focus on meaning. Ellis and Shintani also say that there is a gap or a reason to communicate. I would say that these two first principles really conflate together. To me, they are the same thing. A focus on meaning, to me, implies that there is such a gap or reason to communicate. The third point here is really important because learners rely on their own linguistic and non-linguistic resources. The important point here being that they're not pre-taught before they do the task. This is something that may be debated by various researchers and proponents on TBLT. And certainly teachers, this is something that teachers often resist about TBLT. There is a tendency for teachers to say, hold on a minute. How can I have my students do a task if I don't teach them how to do the task first? And that's an important question to ask. And it is here, I think, that a lot of teachers lose sight of the principles of TBLT. Of course, there's nothing wrong with pre-teaching something. It's just that when you do pre-teach, what you are doing is restricting students to doing it in the way that you have taught them how to do. And if that involves language forms, then what you are doing is kind of setting up an opportunity for students to do a kind of display answer, right? In other words, to do a PPP version rather than TBLT performance. So in TBLT, to put that in another way, one way to think of TBLT that I think is useful is to ask the students to perform a task, allow them to perhaps not perform it so well, to allow them to do it in a way that highlights what the need, what the lack is that they don't have, which then allows you to do a post-task approach where you can then give them suggestions, give them ideas about how to do it again. And ideally, they would then do the task one more time, right? So having them perhaps perform a task and fail, although that's not a great word to use, but not be able to do it completely. And then teach them some ideas about how to do it, and then have them redo the task is kind of at the heart of how TBLT works. Some teachers and some teacher trainers try to get around this a little bit by presenting some kind of model to the students as to what they could be doing. And it's okay to do that to a certain extent, but I think what's important for teachers to do is to bear in mind these principles so that you don't get too far astray and end up doing something that's not TBLT if you're trying to do TBLT. And then again, of course, that same last point here, the clearly defined outcome, which again is crucial. And I'll give you some examples as to how these work in a minute. So some of the task features that are highlighted in the literature are closed tasks versus open tasks. In other words, tasks that have one or more correct outcome, or open tasks which don't have a predetermined solution. Can anybody suggest some ideas of a closed task? I've been assuming, by the way, perhaps I should have asked this at the beginning. I've been assuming that you have some, you have done some reading or some preparation on TBLT before. If I'm wrong, that's fine, but does anyone have an example, or perhaps Intan can?
You mean the closed task here, is it the same just like when we ask our students to have a worksheet and then, for example, fill in the gaps? Because
Yeah,
it might have, yeah, okay.
That's a great example. Filling in the gap or information gap is a perfect example of a closed task. Yeah, exactly. So ISTA as well, short answer questions gap fill. The idea basically is that, so that's okay, Salma. My purpose here today is to give a broad understanding of TBLT. So if you don't, that's okay. With regards to closed tasks and open tasks, a closed task is one that has a correct outcome. And it could be an information gap. An information gap is often, oops, how am I not working? There we go. So for example, spot the difference information gap, right? So like the kids kind of drawing, right? If you work with children, or if you have children, you probably have those pictures where you have the same picture side by side and they have some differences and you have to spot the difference, right? Something like that, where there is a correct outcome that students are expected to get. A little bit perhaps more difficult to define would be Closed tasks focus on a correct outcome. A closed task doesn't have to be, I'm addressing Irma's question here, focus more on accuracy rather than fluency. Closed or open, I would say, are on a different sort of dimension than accuracy versus fluency. You can have an information gap task that has a predetermined outcome that you're leading towards, and the students could perform that task with a focus on fluency, depending on how you set up the task, right? The correct answer itself isn't linguistically, it's not a linguistic target necessarily if you're doing TBLT, right? So for example, again, let's go with an example of a spot the difference, right? You've got two pictures that are the same, except some things that are different in the picture. You would set that up as a task for students where one student is looking at one picture, one and the other, and they have to describe to each other what's in the picture. So, oh, in my picture, the bear is wearing a hat. The other student, oh, no, the bear is not. So they're focusing on fluency in the sense that if they're understanding each other, rather than making correct mistake, accuracy-based mistakes. I hope that answers the question, Irma. So either way, they could be focusing on fluency or accuracy. But TBLT as a general practice will focus on fluency rather than accuracy. As a primary goal, Secondarily, you can, of course, focus on accuracy, and I'll show you how that is done in a minute. And open tasks, of course, don't have a predetermined solution. An example would be something like this. Just to make small talk, just have a conversation. That would be an open task. Write a story when you don't define to the student what kind of story and so on. Just tell a story. That would be an open task. So basically the idea that the student is going towards a correct answer or not, or the answer is open. In either case, they would be assessed by outcome. Okay? In other words, if it's a closed task, the outcome would be, did the students correctly identify all the differences in the spot the difference info gap? That's a clear outcome that's easy to do. With an open task, the outcome would be, did the student write a story, right? Is it a story? Yes or no, right? That's the outcome. Another feature of tasks is whether they're focused or unfocused on language features, okay? And a focus task will be, will target a specific language feature, although ideally it will not do so explicitly. So that when you present a focus task to the students, you're presenting the task and you're not presenting the language. You're not coming into the students and say, today we're going to practice the past tense. Here's the past tense. Now here's the task. That's not the way you do it. You would say, you'd present the task, something that is focused on the past tense. For example, what did you do in your summer vacation, right? It's focused on the past tense because there's a natural tendency for anybody to tell a story in the past if you're talking about your summer vacation. So in that sense, it's focused. You've got an idea of where you want the students to get to. Then the students would tell their story, hopefully using past tense markers or some kind of time marker. And if they fail to do so, using some kind of sense of marking the past tense, then you would come to them and say, here are some ideas. Here's the past tense. And then they could perhaps do the task again. So a focus task could be, here's another example, having the students do a to-do list, which of course has a focus on the imperative voice, right? Go to the supermarket, buy egg, and so on, make a to-do list. You wouldn't necessarily tell the student to use the imperative, but you could, after they try doing it, highlight the imperative and focus on it. And an unfocused task would be any task, frankly. If you as a teacher haven't set a target, then you could call it an unfocused task. It's not something you're focusing on. Focused tasks, of course, are more useful for us in the classroom because it helps us to direct the flow of the lesson. But unfocused tasks can be useful as well. And finally, another feature I wanted to just highlight a little bit here is the difference between pedagogic and real-world tasks. Now, pedagogic tasks depend on a classroom context. Michael Long defines all tasks on a kind of continuum, with the real world being the target, right? So that he calls them target tasks. So anything that you do in the real world is a target task, and anything leading up to that in the classroom is a pedagogic task. They depend on the classroom context, and you can kind of think of them a little bit as on a continuum of authenticity, right? So pedagogic tasks are less real world like and may depend, oops, how did that happen? Here we go. May depend on the context of the classroom to work, right? So for example, arrange a mixed up paragraph is quite far away from the real world, right? For example, when was the last time, your boss came into the room and said, hey, I've got this mixed up paragraph here, put it together for me, right? It's just not something that happens in the real world. It's kind of contrived. So that's a pedagogic task. It's still useful. There's still advantages that are gained from doing this that lead towards a real world task in the end. A real world task in a pure sense would be something like ordering at a restaurant, right? You can also see how again, the continuum between pedagogic and real world is a little bit problematic. So for example, with a real world task, unless you literally go out to a restaurant and try ordering, it's always going to be somewhat of a pedagogic task. In other words, you can simulate a restaurant situation in the classroom, but because you're in the classroom, it's always going to have that kind of pedagogic slant to it, which involves all kinds of, I think, important considerations for teachers. So for example, you can simulate a restaurant all you want in the classroom, but the fact that there is a teacher and there's a kind of power relation between teachers and students, there is, assessment requirements, students know that they are being graded, for example, will make that task always a little bit less authentic than the real world situation. So we can think of these kind of on a continuum. And I think it's important to think this way because it helps us to position our tasks in relation to how tasky they are, if I can coin a word here. Tasky in the sense of those principles that I mentioned before. So do think of them on a continuum. I don't mean to suggest that all good tasks are unfocused or that all good tasks are open. But I do think that we need to consider these as we prepare tasks for the classroom so that they're valid tasks and they work the way they're meant to work. All right, so let me show an example task, and I'll give you an opportunity here to consider those features: closed, open, focused, unfocused, pedagogic, and real world. So let's try an example task with these images. And let's say you are doing this in the classroom. You present your students with these images, and then you give a task. Describe one of the pictures. Okay. Now, is that a closed or an open task?
It's an open one because we can have many answers from the student.
Right. So it's open along a few dimensions, right? One of the ways in which it's open is that there are 3 pictures and you're choosing one, so you're not restricted to one particular picture. This can be facilitated for the students, by the way, by giving them a range of choices, because it allows them to choose one that they are more comfortable talking about. or perhaps they know more about. So a student, for example, who is interested in driving might choose that middle picture. And because they're interested in driving, they'll be able to talk about driving a little bit better, right? So, or write about, by the way. I didn't make this point today about speaking versus writing versus listening and so on, but TBLT applies equally to all skills, okay? There is sometimes people think that TBLT must be only about oral, only about spoken performance, but it applies equally to writing as well. So when I say describe, this could be a writing assignment or it could be a speaking assignment. So it's relatively open. You could argue that it's somewhat closed along some dimensions. For example, it is a finite range of pictures. It would be far more open if you were to, for example, allow your students to choose a picture online and then talk about it. That would be a far more open task. Is it focused or unfocused? Now it may be a little bit harder, a little bit fuzzier. Is it focused or unfocused? Or remember, the focused or unfocused
Focus.
means on
The
the language.
characters are almost the same from one picture to another. It's focus.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the spoken comments.
It's focus because we see that the pictures, the characters of the pictures are same from one picture to another.
So you're saying it's focused on vocabulary, for example?
No, on
Content?
the flow of the descriptions of the pictures.
So with focus versus unfocused, we are talking about focus on language features. So which language feature would you be identifying here? Using simple present. So on the chat, people have made some comments. So for example, using simple present.
Oh, you can simple present. Yes.
Describing people, verbs and adjectives. Yeah, so the focus can be any of these, right? So as a teacher, if that's your focus for the lesson, then you could say it's focused because of those reasons. Present continuous. You could focus it on the past tense by setting up the task and saying, this is, this girl's name is Mary. This is what she did on her summer vacation. Tell the story, right? And now you've focused it on the past tense, but you could focus it on any tense that you like. You could focus it on future aspects by saying, these are things you might do next week, right? So talk about it in the future. So in that case, it could be focused on future. Or if you don't do any of those things and you have no expectation of where students are going to go with the picture, with the story, then it would be unfocused, right? So what I'm trying to show is that it depends on the context and it depends on how you set up the task. It could be open, closed, focused or unfocused. And finally, what about pedagogic and real world? I think the answer here is maybe a little easier. Real world. That wasn't what I was expecting. Again, I'm talking about the task itself rather than what the girls are doing in the picture, right? The task itself, describe the series of pictures, is somewhat pedagogic, right? You don't often do that as a real world task. It's not the same thing as ordering takeaway from the restaurant, right? Which is a real world task. Or making a hotel reservation, that's a real world task. Describing a series of pictures is somewhat pedagogic, right? You don't often have to do that as a thing that you do in your real life. And that's the consideration. Now, perhaps if you had your students go out into the park and actually look at people and describe them, then that would make it a little bit more of a real world activity. That might be something people actually do. Yeah, that's right, Astrid. So depending on the context of the teacher, it depends on the aims of the lesson, frankly. whether it's focus or unfocused, right? So again, to me, this is what's really important about TBLT, is that it allows teachers to teach communicatively with some guidelines, some parameters that don't really exist in the real world. If you think of communicative language approach as a really broad sort of approach, all that the communicative approach really tells us is that meaning is important. That's the only real principle of the communicative approach, frankly, is that communication is important and that language shouldn't be taught simply as language, but as a tool to communicate, right? That's all that the communicative approach really tells us. What TBLT does is it takes that, and so under that umbrella, it gives us tools to then set up communicative teaching in ways that are meaningful and allow us to have lesson progression. One of the problems that we've had here in Japan with communicative language teaching is, so for example, people do conversational, private conversational schools, right? They go to private conversational schools. Perhaps it's the same in Indonesia. I'm sure it is, actually. You have private conversation schools, you go there, you chat, right? You talk about all kinds of things, which is very good. It's a great way to learn English. But the problem from a pedagogic point of view is, okay, so today we're chatting about sports, tomorrow we're gonna chat about something else. Where is the progression, the pedagogic progression, the educational sequence of those lessons? It's difficult to do, and it's difficult to correlate what you're doing with sort of assessment goals, right? Are you getting better? You know, we're chatting about stuff and you're getting more fluent, but what does that mean? It's all very fuzzy. What task-based learning allows us to do is to set some parameters and go, okay, look, yes, we're communicating and it's relatively open, but we are focusing on being able to talk about these kinds of things. That goes to what can-do statements are, which I'll get to in a moment, a little bit down. I hope that's clear. So we should have clear instructions and goals for the task. You do need to have clear goal for the task. On the instructional side, again, the danger is instructing too much on language goals, focusing too much on language goals as to what you tell the student. Because the problem is, here's one of the fundamental principles of communicativeness, right? Which is that when we set out to communicate, we don't think, okay, now I'm going to use the past tense, right? That's not how communication in the real world works. We set out to do something, and then we might come back and go, okay, maybe the past tense will help me, and then we think about the past tense. But we don't set out to use the past tense. That's the way sort of natural life happens, right? To give you an example, if I'm going to call a pizza restaurant and order a pizza, what I'm thinking is getting a pizza. I'm not thinking about whether I'm going to be using the vocabulary appropriately, right? And in fact, whether I get that pizza is the important thing. It's not whether I made a mistake with some of the vocabulary. And so when you give clear instructions and those instructions focus on language, what you're doing really is you're restricting students to only using that language. So if you come into class and you say, okay, class, today we're going to do the past tense, and then you tell them, but don't worry about that, let's just do this task instead. What are they going to do? Well, they're going to use the past tense to do your task because you're the teacher and they want to please you and so on. So therefore, it's better to come in and not tell them we're going to do the past tense today. Come in and say, now in your mind as a teacher, you're thinking, ooh, I just got some feedback there.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, it's okay. It's okay.
So in your mind as a teacher, you're thinking, today we're going to focus on the past tense. But what you do instead is you set up, okay, let's talk about what you did on the weekend. Now the students are going to try to perform the task. perhaps they're not going to be able to because they don't know the past tense very well. That's when you go, okay, well, try using this form. And then they try it, and then they do the task again. And then you can focus on the language, on the form, on the forms afterwards, right? Because your primary focus is on the communicative side, on communication. I'll go to the next one as an example, and this would be a different task in this case, but this goes to Diba's last comment here, instructions and goals for the task. The task has to be clear what you want the student to do, right? So in the first one would be just choose a picture and describe it. The second one is a little bit more complex, right? Task complexity has gone up a little bit because you're not just choosing one to describe it, you're telling a story using all three pictures, and perhaps you can reorder the pictures if you like. That becomes a little bit more complex task. And I'll talk about complexity in a minute because that's also really important to task-based learning. Let's stop for a minute and think about the task as a unit, because now that we're thinking about tasks as a unit, it's now we can think of them in terms of complexity relative to each other, right? So task number 2 here is more complex, it's more difficult than task number 1, which now allows us to have a kind of sequence, a pedagogical sequence, where we get to a better and better use of language, right? It's more difficult to do number 2. And this sequence is what's missing from the communicative approach in a broad sense. And it's what TBLT brings to the table, which is something super important, very important, that sometimes gets missed when people talk about task-based learning. I'll get back to, please. Somebody?
No, it's just an echo, I think.
Just an echo?
You can continue. Yeah.
Okay. Here's another example task. So this one is a reading and writing one. So imagine it's an email, right? And the email says, "Dear applicant, please send your flight number, date, and time of arrival, and I will meet you at the airport." It has a name, Jessica Sparks. So it's a very short email, very practical sort of outcome. What's the outcome here? Well, in other words, what does the student need to do? What's the task? The task and the outcome are connected together. The task would be read the email and write a response. Okay, read the email and write a response. That's the task. Now, the outcome needs to be clear, needs to include certain kinds of information. It needs to include, of course, the flight number and time. It needs to follow the format of an email in an acceptable way. It doesn't need to be 100% accurate in terms of language forms, right? The student could make a spelling mistake on the word flight, and it wouldn't impact the outcome. The outcome would still be a pass if they include the correct information. And so they would need to respond appropriately. And again, I'll get back to this idea of appropriately in a minute, because that's where things get a little fuzzy. However, we can look at this task as something the student has to do, which has a clear outcome, and which would be more or less difficult than other tasks that they might do. This would be focused or unfocused, open, closed, pedagogic, real world. What do you think? Let's say closed or open first. Focused, real world. I think towards the real world side is a good way to put it. Open, I would say it's not so open, because it's not just it's not like having a conversation where you could talk about anything. It's closed in the sense that it's asking for certain kind of information quite specifically, right? And focused, well, again, focused would depend on your aim for the lesson. It could be focused on you know, using the present tense, using the future, or understanding those things. So focused it would depend on your own aims as a teacher. But I think real world is definitely correct, and I would say it's relatively closed compared to other emails that you might have students write. And finally, and we'll look at a concrete example of this one in a minute. This is an elevator pitch. Are you familiar with elevator pitch as a task? Does anyone? Maybe Intan can speak for everyone. Is that a commonly
elevator pitch? Maybe it's not really contextual in our culture.
No? Okay. So it may not be. It may not be. An elevator pitch is a kind of, think of it as an opportunity to pitch an idea, right? It's called an elevator pitch because of the time it takes to get into the elevator and get out of the elevator. During that time, imagine you're talking to the president of your university. Just luckily, right? You got into the elevator with the president of your university. You have this great idea for a new course. And you pitch it for time.
So this elevator pitch is a kind of task, a form of task that we can use.
Yeah. So in this case, it's very real world. It's very real world. It's something that people actually do. They pitch, they share their idea with somebody in their company. And the parameters of it are that it's short. That's why it's called an elevator pitch. It could happen anywhere. It could happen in a taxi. It could happen as you're waiting in line at the cafeteria, right? Anytime that you have 1 minute or so to share an idea quickly and kind of persuasively. So I'll show you an example of an elevator pitch later. It's a relatively complex task, even though it's short. It's a kind of mini presentation. And it includes kind of persuasiveness as one of the criteria. But basically, yeah, prepare a 1 minute elevator pitch would be real world, towards the real world side of things. And it would be focused on quite a number of language forms, as well as pragmatic forms like, being persuasive, for example, or getting someone to accept your idea. You could have that as a focus as well. Yeah, thank you, Intan. Persuasiveness, yeah. And closed or open, well, again, it's closed in the sense that you have to have a clear idea that you're pitching. But it could be open if you allow the students to pitch anything versus make them pitch a particular product, right? Or idea. Okay, so that's some of the basics about TBLT. But what I want to do now is, why do we need TBLT? And I had this, what I think is a great idea. I hope you like the analogy. I had this analogy that I think to me helps to explain TBLT in a really sort of easy to understand and intuitive way. Why we need TBLT. So what I'd like you to do is to take a moment and to think about language. And I want you to think about how language is like a cloud. How is language like a cloud? Let's see if we get, maybe you can write a few ideas into the chat. How is language like a cloud? Let's see if this works. Because it's flexible. I think that's on the right track. It changes, as you can see in my picture here, it's changing, right? The edges are changing. It's kind of fuzzy at the edges. I would go beyond, Salma's answer is it changes every now and then. I would go beyond that, and I would say it's always changing. It's never static, it's always changing. Anything else? It's flexible, yeah. It's shapeless, might be another way to say that. It's amorphous, it doesn't have a shape. It's just kind of blue, right? Always moving around. In itself, it's shapeless, right? But people give certain meanings to shapes that they recognize. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that one. So we can look at clouds in the sky and think, oh, that looks like a horse or something like that, right? It's everywhere is interesting. It's floating, it can be dense. How about it's above us? There's some new ideas here I hadn't actually thought of. Imagine it's above us is an interesting way to think about it, and I like the idea that it's everywhere. You can see certain shapes and so on. Think about it this way: if you are inside that cloud, then you are clearly it's clearly all around you, and you know that you are somewhere. But if you start to move away from it, have you ever been in a situation? Maybe you're in an airplane and you're about to fly through the clouds, right? You see the clouds are coming, and you're getting closer to the clouds, but it's fuzzy. You don't know the point at which you have entered the cloud, right? It's hard to tell. You just go from being clear to being in the cloud, but in between there's a kind of fuzzy period, and you can't tell that you're in there. And I think that's important because it's a feature of language that it's shapeless, but at the same time we can point to it and say that's English, right? Especially the farther away we are from it, the more we can see the shape, and the less it seems to change. Okay, so if you get farther and farther away from the language and you kind of look at it from a cloud, you can look at the cloud and it doesn't look like it's changing. But the closer you get to it, the more you can see that the edges are changing. And I think language works the same way, because it's difficult. From far away, you can say, yes, this is English. But the closer you get to the language, the less you can be certain, right? That certain words, for example, are really English. Maybe they're borrowed words from other languages. In fact, if you've got two clouds and the two clouds kind of bump into each other, it's hard to tell where one begins and one ends. There are two clouds, but they're sort of fuzzy in between. And the distance between languages are like that as well, right? So if you've got English over here and French over here, and you're far away from both, you can say, oh yeah, that's English. Oh yeah, that's French. But the closer you get and the closer they get to each other, the more things kind of get fuzzy and mixed up together. Languages are complex, like clouds are complex, and they're always changing. And that's a little bit of a problem for us as teachers, because it makes it difficult for us to be able to describe it very well to students. And this really is at the heart of language teaching. And so people talk about methods and approaches and so on. I would say that really there are only two approaches to language teaching, to classifying language, that make any sense for language teaching. And one of them is to kind of lay a grid over it. Okay? Now, you'll notice that my cloud stopped moving here. So one of the things that you can do if you want to describe a cloud, if you want to describe language, is you can kind of create a static picture of it and kind of create a grid, and then use that grid to define the pieces. And then you can do a pretty good job of it. This is actually a good way of classifying things in the real world, because the real world is complex. There's a kind of trick, in fact, right? So if you create this kind of, if you've got something that's complex, let's look at a different kind of picture, but it's the same idea. So this is an image, and I'm going to show you, this is a trick that artists use. If you are somebody who likes drawing and painting, perhaps you've done this yourself. What artists do if they want to duplicate a picture, they want to create a picture, is they put a grid over it, and then they create a blank piece of paper with the same grid, and they go little by little, bit by bit, and they kind of copy that picture from one to the other, right? Until in the end, they have something that's a complete picture. Okay? And we do the same with language. When we teach using a kind of forms focus or grammar focus, this is what we're doing, really, right? We are telling we're coming into the classroom, we're telling students, okay, guys, today we're going to learn this little piece of English. Today we're going to learn this little piece of English and this little piece of English. And one day in the future, you get to the whole thing, right? Don't get me wrong, this is an efficient way of doing many things. It's an efficient way of drawing a picture. It's a great way of sort of defining what a cloud is and creating a reproduction of it. But for language teaching, it has one big problem. Can anybody guess what I'm getting at here? This approach to teaching language bit by bit has one real big drawback. Anybody have an idea what the drawback is? It's a good way to teach according to accuracy, right? So each frame of my picture here is quite accurate, and you can test it easily. You can have the students draw these sections of the grid, and then you can test them on whether they've drawn it well. It limits the user. That's an interesting point that I hadn't considered. Maybe it does limit the user to only focusing on this particular picture. When one pattern is wrong, then the rest will be worse. That's an interesting idea as well. It's also not where I'm headed. Limit creativity, again, interesting. You could argue that if you're an artist, it's far more interesting to just draw a picture instead of having to copy one. But let's say you want to copy one for some kind of reason, right? For some kind of practical reason. Because that's what we're doing, right? When we're learning a language, we want to copy that language into our brain so that it works for us. So you can say it limits creativity, and I don't disagree. It's just that maybe creativity isn't always the most important thing to be doing when we're learning a language. Certainly learning the pieces accurately. Accuracy is important in language learning, right? It's got to do with motivation. What's the problem with motivation here?
So when the students just follow the pattern, then they will have less motivation to enhance or elaborate that.
Sure. Again, yeah, that goes to creativity again, right? It's hard to see the purpose of doing it. Maybe. Astri, full marks for Astri here. I think that's the real problem. I think this is the real problem. You don't have a full picture. Until you get to the end, you have nothing, right? And this is a problem for students. When you're an artist and you're copying a picture this way, it's fine because you'll be done in a couple of hours, right? For a student, this process will take months and years until you get here, right? So the problem is you're spending all that time and you're learning and you're learning and you're learning, but you don't have anything to show for it until maybe 2 years later, when finally you can say, I have the language, I can use it, right? And that's really the problem with this approach. It's not that it's not effective. It's true that it's not creative, but maybe creativity isn't the only important thing. Those things are true, but I think the real problem is that you don't ever get to a point where you can use the language until the end. And for that reason, it's really hard for many students to get to the end. You're asking them to study this thing, to create this thing with a kind of delayed gratification, right? You'll have nothing until you get there. And that's, I think, a really important problem, is the motivational problem of this kind of teaching, sort of systematically this way. So what's the solution? Well, here is where TBLT does bring in, I think, a really important solution. What does TBLT do? How is the model different with TBLT? I'll give extra bonus points here. So in this case, students' motivation needs to be sustained until they get the whole picture. Yeah. So TBLT does that, but how does it do it? How is TBLT better for motivation? thinking about the earlier model. So the earlier model basically creates this kind of grid. It's very systematic, right? Piece by piece. TBLT is kind of the opposite of piece by piece. Good word is the opposite of piece by piece. It's, oops, that was a direct, put that to everybody. That's a good point too, Intan. There's more inherent motivation because it's practical. And that's a big part of TBLT. And project learning, again, it's practical. You can see the real world applications. So those things are good. But thinking about this model of how to define this fuzzy thing that is language, TBLT is holistic. Yeah, so Irma's point as well is good. But TBLT is holistic. It's not a kind of a discrete system of piece by piece, right? So the way you describe it, again, if you're going to go back to this model and thinking about art, right? So I showed you a model how artists will copy a picture from one to the other. One way to describe language in a holistic way, what TBLT does really well is, oops. I'll get back to this. Oh, where's my picture? Here we go. I'll show you the pictures first and then I'll go back to the quote. So TBLT doesn't give you that forms focused. It gives you the whole picture, but it's not fully formed yet. Okay, but it's the whole picture. You can look at this picture and you can say, okay, this is a cloud. It's not a great cloud, but it's a cloud. It has a meaning, right? This is a cloud, again, if you're looking at that model. This is a cloud. None of these is perfectly formed, but each of them is a complete thing, getting better and better and better until at some point you get to the full picture of a cloud. So in other words, TBLT is holistic. It shows you the whole thing. It focuses on meaning, on the meaning of the thing. It's a cloud, it's a cloud, it's a cloud, it's a cloud, until you finally get the cloud right? And that's a different perspective of, I think, thinking about how to present language to students. You can present it bit by bit, or you can simply jump in and do something that won't be fully formed, won't be perfect, but it's a step towards that whole thing. It's holistic. And that ties in nicely. I'll go back to the quote now. Sorry for jumping around like this. But this is a quote from Michael Long, and he basically sets it this way. TBLT instructional materials take the form of pedagogic tasks, which are initially simple and progressively more complex approximations of the original target task. So the target task, or the target thing being the cloud, a pedagogical task, which is the thing you do in the classroom, sketch, 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 and then you get that final cloud at the end. And that's what long means. Long is, I think, in my opinion, the leading thinker in TBLT, because he is very focused on these principles of TBLT, and he doesn't compromise them. But he's a little bit dense. He's a little bit hard to read. Frankly, I get a bit of a headache every time I try to read Michael Long. It's very important, very useful information, but sometimes it's hard to get the meaning behind what he's saying. And I think if you think about my little cloud model, it helps to understand. Maybe a better way of framing it would be to say a pedagogic task, which is a classroom-based task, is a holistically meaningful approximation of a real-world task. In other words, it's not just part of a task, it's the whole task. So to go back to my example of, for example, ordering a pizza by telephone, right? A pedagogic task would be telling the students, get on the phone and try to order a pizza. That's holistic, right? What would not be holistic would be to give them a list of vocabulary first, and then practice, you know, how do you say hello on the telephone? Hi, good morning, right? Bit by bit, piece by piece. That's the opposite, right? So that's how I think TBLT should be approached, should be thought of as an approach. And I know maybe my model of the cloud might be a little bit too simplistic. And some of you might be beyond this in your understanding of TBLT, but I think simple is important because many teachers don't quite get the point. Why do we do TBLT? And that's why we do TBLT, because it allows us to focus on the holistic meaning of something, which is also important, right? The step-by-step focus on pieces of the language, accuracy, is also important, of course. But it allows us to focus on the big picture. Okay, so I think, there we go. So let's get to the third point, which is how do we do TBLT? And there are all kinds of, here, there are all kinds of excellent books on how to do TBLT. I think one of the best ones is Doing Task-Based Language Teaching by Jane and David Willis. There are books by David Noonan, for example. This one's a little bit old now. Task-Based Language Teaching is a very practical step-by-step guide. There's a lot of resources out there that give you ideas on how to do TBLT. And they range between very practical, which Jane Willis, I think, is, to a little bit more theoretical. So I don't want to cover the same ground that you can get from some of these resources. What I wanted to focus on is a couple of specific points that I think are very helpful to doing TBLT in the classroom. And again, we go back to this idea, first of all, focusing on the task as a unit of sequencing and instruction. Okay, so we've talked about different kinds of tasks. How to sequence them in lessons is really important. And I'll give you a model on how you can do that. And then on outcome assessment. Assessment is very important, and its importance is not stated strongly enough in the literature, I think, because assessment is where teachers often go wrong when they do TBLT. So again, the two key factors I'd like you to consider specifically today are sequencing, and sequencing by task complexity, and also assessment, which is by outcome, okay? So let me give you some, well, I'll give you a little bit of theory, and then I'll show you an example. So again, back to Michael Long, he says that instructional materials for TBLT take the form of pedagogic tasks, as I mentioned before, which are simple to complex, okay? The second paragraph here, he says, multiple series of pedagogic tasks are sequenced for classroom use by their intrinsic complexity. And he specifically says task complexity, not linguistic complexity. Okay, so the first organizing principle that we should think about when we're creating tasks and putting them in order is how complex are they? How difficult are they in relation to each other? Okay, and if we can do that, we can then afterwards look at linguistic factors. And of course, according to Long, these series of tasks form a task syllabus. Very importantly, and again, this is a very strong take on TBLT, and I think it's an important one. There's no linguistic syllabus that's either overt or covert. He refers to Pitt Corder's, really old now, 67, but I'm sure you've heard of it, the idea of the learner syllabus. And the idea there is that with a grammar syllabus, there's this assumption that teachers make that it's easy to sequence grammar items and vocabulary in order from easy to difficult. It may be so, but it depends on the criteria that you're using on one hand, but it also depends, and this has been validated by research, it depends on the needs of the student. and their first language as well. So just to give you a quick example, one of the most difficult things that I find teaching my students here in Japan is the plural S in English, right? So one dog, two dogs, right? Is very difficult for students to learn. And the reason for that is in their first language, there's no pluralization in Japanese. Now, it's exceedingly difficult. Another one is articles, the, a, or nothing, right? It's very difficult for Japanese students because in Japanese, again, there are no articles. However, both of those things are really easy. They're among the first things you learn if you're a Spanish learner of English. So if you speak Spanish, you already have plural S, and you already have articles because they exist in Spanish. So they're right at the bottom. They're very easy to teach. But for Japanese learners, they're way at the top. They're really difficult. So this idea that grammar complexity is easy to sequence is frankly not true. And so the best that we can do, I think in that case, would be to have a grammar syllabus that's focused on particular learners. And of course, that's one practical way of doing it. Another one would be to not have a grammar syllabus at all, focus on tasks, and present students with a series of tasks again and again and again that would naturally necessitate certain kinds of language forms, and ideally recycle them as well. Because if you do the same task again, the same type of language form will appear again and again, and will give you an opportunity to practice it. So that's the idea of task complexity, right? Task difficulty, because sequencing is important. So the key issue for TBLT then becomes to determine how do we do relative complexity of the tasks to each other. And of course, this is important because increasing complexity increases student attention to various things. It also increases their focus on accuracy. And so having students work on more and more complex tasks should lead to interlanguage development. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? So I hope this figure here kind of helps to understand what I mean. So I've got three sort of tasks here. The first one would be greeting, introducing yourself to someone, relatively simple. The next one would be giving a presentation, for example, perhaps a short presentation to your group of peers. And the last one I've got here could be something like a longer, more difficult presentation, a press conference, where perhaps the audience is not so friendly, which again increases task complexity as well. If you've been watching, for example, the American elections recently, which I find fascinating. As a Canadian, I find fascinating to watch what's going on in the United States. But for example, the new president that's been elected, Biden, he has a stutter, right? He doesn't speak so fluently. He's had to overcome that in his life. He has a bit of a stutter. So for him, the task complexity of doing something like a news conference is even more complex than it would be for someone who doesn't have that problem. Because of the affective factors inherent in a news conference. You've got audience members who maybe are trying to catch you making a mistake, that kind of thing. So this might be one way to sequence task complexity. But how do we do that practically in a syllabus? Here is my answer. And I'll give you a chance to practice this in a breakout room in a minute. So what I came up with, and this goes back to my own textbook writing work, is in order to have a properly task-based syllabus, you can't begin with language forms. That's the way lesson planning usually works. You have a list of forms, and then you come up with communicative activities to target those. TBLT can be done in a flipped way by introducing the idea of a theme as an organizing principle. And so this is what I did with my book, and I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute. But basically, what I'd like to suggest is that you can begin with a theme, and the theme can be all kinds of things. Here are a few examples I've put down. Scrapbooking, or detective fiction, or sports, for example, or running a restaurant, love and dating, depending on who your students are, of course, and the kind of content that you can provide. But once you create a theme, that theme then allows you to think of some main tasks that might fit in. So let's go with sports, for example. So if you've got a theme of sports, what are some tasks or projects? If you're thinking about project-based learning, for example, what are some tasks or projects that you could do if you're doing a lesson, a syllabus based on sports? Can anybody suggest a couple of tasks, big tasks, projects?
Describe favorite football player.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Describe favorite football player.
Describe your favorite football player is good, but it's not big enough. Let's think of a project, something a little bigger.
Okay.
Sports festival is good.
Yeah, like arranging a marathon competition, for example.
Okay, good. Yeah, so a sports festival, whoops, it's hard to write with this thing. Sports festival or competition, right? For example, so basically organize, right? Organize a sports festival or competition. That would be one sort of main task. Or a sports event. Another one that somebody put here, sports news. So that could be something like, yeah, I don't, how would you do that? Kind of like planning a newspaper, right? So sports news desk. So create a sports news desk, something like that, like on a TV station. Kind of sports teenagers like. Yeah. That's not big enough. I'm thinking of a project to have students do that might take all semester, or it might be part of a, the theme itself would take all semester, all term, but the main tasks would be projects within that theme. Talk show. I think a news desk or a sports show, those kind of fit in together. Sorry, go on.
Well, what about inviting players or inviting
Other teams?
Teams, yeah. Will that be?
Hold that thought for a minute, because I think we can put that under the supporting task.
Yeah, I think so.
Here. Another big one, maybe less big than some of these, could be something like, let's see, create a new sport, right? Maybe design a new sport, create rules or something like that. So these are just a few examples, right? Now, we can start kind of thinking about how these fit in with each other, right? Depending on how we focus it on language, depending how open and closed they are, we could start thinking about, and also on a kind of like intuitive narrative sense, where do they fit in together? Which one would be number 1, 2, and 3? What would be easiest to do, in other words? What would be an easier thing to do first? Maybe the order is already good.
Like, forming a committee, or organizing the committee, or making the poster.
You're already thinking about supporting tasks, but I'm thinking more
okay.
project level. So talking about these main tasks, which one which one here, I can't get my, here we go. Which one of these, 1, 2, or 3, is the order right, in other words? Is it 1, 2, 3, or should it be maybe 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, Irma says. 1, 2, 3, Alia says 2, 1, 3. A couple of people have said 2 first. And I think I would tend to agree. There's no correct answer here because it depends on how you're going to.
Sorry, you can go.
There's no absolutely correct answer here because it depends on how you're framing the tasks in your mind and how you're going to set them up for students, how complex they will be. But in the way that I'm envisioning this, I would say that this is probably number 1, and this is probably number 2, or actually maybe this is number 3. Yeah, so I think I would say 2, 3, 1. Did anybody have that same one? No. 2, 3, 1. Yeah, over my head. Okay. But again, this is not an absolutely right or wrong kind of situation. It just depends on how I'm envisioning creating the syllabus, right? And what I'm thinking is you start with something that's kind of descriptive, allows the students to see some models of how people talk about sports. Maybe you can begin with some listening activities where you actually watch some sports news on TV, that kind of thing. And then I would move towards, perhaps before creating a new sport, maybe a subtask could be something like describing, and this goes to some of the ideas that Irma had a little bit earlier. So for example, describe your favorite sport, give rules, right? Present the rules, or teach someone the rules. Teach the rules to your favorite sport and so on. And then perhaps ending with something like create a new sport and teach others how to play it, right? So I'm thinking in terms of how complex these are in relation to each other, because I'm already thinking a little bit about language targets as well. Now, language target for describe your favorite sport could be as simple as vocabulary that has to do with the uniform, right? So colors, talking about colors, talking about simple action verbs like run and hit and so on. Or it could be more complex than that, depending on the level of your students and the age as well. But again, you can see how after creating this themed syllabus with some big tasks, we're getting smaller and smaller towards the language rather than the other way around. And we're also talking about relative complexity between these main tasks. I kind of started talking about the sports here. Yeah, example how to play from Susanti is, Ista's example as well. So you can see how as a whole semester, you can get a lot of use out of this syllabus that you're creating, this themed syllabus. And it's inherently focused on meaning because of that theme. So you don't lose sight of those TBLT principles, which is the main danger for teachers. What tends to happen, the usual way is to go this way, right? To go from here to here. This is the way syllabus is usually created. This is not drawing very good pictures here. Syllabus writers, textbook writers, and teachers often start with a language syllabus, with a list of things that they have to cover. And then they start thinking, okay, how can I make that meaningful? How can I make that meaningful? Which can work, but the problem is this is primary. And if this is primary, it's going to be primary from an assessment point as well. And that becomes problematic in TBLT. So what I suggest is the better way to go is to start from theme and then work your way towards target, but with a little bit of a reciprocal kind of mechanism, because you can always kind of go back and go, wait a minute, I've missed this language target that's also really important. But then you can fit it into the framework once you've collected the framework. I'm going to clear this particular example because it's getting kind of messy here. And I'll give you something a little more solid, which is basically actually how I designed my, my textbook. And this is, the textbook is a simulation. And in the book, the students simulate working at a company. Okay, so work at a startup company is the theme. Okay, so we came up with this idea, and then we thought, okay, what are some of the main tasks or projects that then students are going to be doing in this course? And we thought of all kinds of stuff, like this would be like R&D, right? Research a new product idea, come up with some ideas for a product for the company. It's a startup company. Something else that they'll need to do is actually to choose a product to go into production, a kind of management decision, right? And something else that they might do is perform market research and find out if people actually like the idea. So these are kind of projects that they'll go with, and these are the main tasks. But when we started with the theme, when we first thought of this and we thought, okay, here's the theme, we're going to pretend we're going to create a simulation of working at a company. The first task that came to our mind was logically what the first task would be. What would be the first task working in a company? If you can imagine like creating a simulation where students are going to get a job, what would be the first project or task that you might have them do, the first big sort of thing?
Looking for a job vacancy. Looking
for a job, yeah. And so when we started thinking about it in this sense, one of the first things we wrote down is an interview, a job interview. Now, think about these in relation to each other. And what we clearly realized, this is where creating this framework becomes important, because we thought, okay, here's a main task, here's another main task. I should be here actually. Here's another one, here's another one. And we brainstormed all these ideas, and then we thought, okay, so let's create the book. Now, what comes first? Well, clearly this one should come first because it makes sense, right? You get the job first of all. But the more we thought about it, the more we realized that a job interview is inherently much more complex than any of the other sort of big projects that we had. And because we had this theme to organize things, we thought, okay, we can't do a job interview first because it's much more complex. So either we can do a very simple job interview, or we can put job interview at the end. How can we put job interview at the end? Well, again, let's think about the theme. You're working at a company. How can you have a job interview afterwards? That doesn't make any sense. Oh, how about you start as an intern and you do all this work, and then at the end, you apply for a job in the company. Okay, and so the theme helped us to organize the projects and tasks in terms of complexity. And once we did that, then we could start thinking of the subtasks that go with each of these, right? So doing a market research, what are you going to do? Well, you've got to prepare survey questions, you've got to run a focus group, and then maybe you present research results. That could be an actual presentation task. This is a kind of presentation task as well. This one can lead into this one. This leads into this one. They are sequenced by complexity. And from 1, 2, 3 here, these are also sequenced by complexity. So for example, give a poster presentation and give a more traditional kind of presentation and make an elevator pitch. These are all tasks that the main task for the section that the student has to do. And again, it's an increasing level of complexity. An elevator pitch is short. It's video recorded in this case, so students can do it again and again many times. Then they go to something that's live, but they also do many times, and it's a little bit less intimidating. And then they go from that to a full-on presentation. So this framework helps you to kind of create your syllabus, and it does provide space for language targets at the end. And again, these language targets, you don't have to rank them in terms of complexity necessarily, although often they do kind of fall that way. The other advantage is that there's a kind of recycling effect, because if you're brainstorming product ideas and then you are here discussing a product, these product ideas appear again, right? So the theme allows you to recycle a lot of the language stuff. And so describing things using adjectives, you do it here, but you do it here as well, here in the context of giving opinions, okay? So this is a kind of a framework that allows you to present information in a way that's more principled to TBLT. So what I'd like to do now, if it's okay, is to take, and here is a more finished version of our sequence, which again is by task sequencing. So stage 1, this is what we ended up with in the end. Students join the company orientation, so it's a kind of easy task at the beginning. They prepare product proposals, then they discuss and evaluate product proposals, then they do market research, then advertising, and then that interview at the end, which is the most difficult task. But what I'd like you to do for a moment now is to think of some themes and tasks and support tasks for any idea that you would like that could be a themed lesson. And I think maybe if we can give everyone 5 minutes or so to come up with some ideas, I think that might be useful. And then we can discuss 1 or 2 afterwards. We have about half an hour left. So let's say 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Okay. Do you want to have the breakout rooms, or we just discuss here in the main room? Which one?
I was thinking of doing a breakout room. What do you think?
Okay. Okay. How many rooms do you want to have?
Maybe 3 or 4 people maximum per room.
Okay. Right. So we have 100 more. We have.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah.
123 people are watching. This task has suddenly become much more complex for me.
No, it's okay. You did great. This is very hands-on. Okay, I would like to.
So let me stop sharing. That would make it easier.
Okay.
Okay. I'll stop sharing. And maybe if people can, in breakout rooms, brainstorm themes and some of the big projects, that would be good. Okay.
All right. So can you share the file so that we can fill it in the chat, maybe?
Yep.
Then I will assign all the participants in the breakout rooms.
I have created a Google Drive.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Where is it? Here we go. A shared folder on Google Drive. It has a few things in there. The one you want right now is, sorry, I'll give you the link. The one you're looking for right now is the, sorry, where's the title? The sample syllabus at the top. I think that one is actually filled in.
So Bapak Ibu, you can click the link as shared by Marcos.
Yeah.
It will lead you to the drive. So after you click the link, you will be directed to this one. And then we can open this file.
Yeah,
Marcos, right? The sample theme.
That's right. So that just gives you the same that I showed you before. But you can write on, I don't expect you to finish the whole thing like this, right? So maybe everyone could think of a theme and maybe a couple of big projects. That should be enough for now.
Okay, all right. So I will assign the participants in breakout rooms. Yeah. So, Bapak,
Hai Lulu, hai Aul.
Halo Mbak Salma.
Rooms. That's going to be too
yeah,
many.
because we have 123 participants.
Mhm.
So if each group should have 4, then
Okay.
it's 30 rooms. Okay.
Okay. So if we can maybe go back in
the main room?
3 minutes more.
3 minutes. Okay. All right. Okay.
This can also be a kind of break for everyone too, if they
yeah.
listen.
Yeah. Marcos, we have Ibu Ami here in this breakout room. Ibu Ami is one of our favorite teachers in high school.
High school. Okay.
Yeah. Ibu Ami, yeah.
Nice to know you, Marcos. Thank you, Bu Intan.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for participating.
Pleasure.
Actually, I was trying to go through the different rooms and ask if people
Yes.
have questions.
All right.
Okay.
If you have a question, now is a good time. Ami, what do you think?
Well, actually, my question is,
Please, yeah.
yeah, if we have a very short time, I mean, for 3 times meeting, can we make the ideal task-based learning approach?
If you have
For
a
3
very
times
short
meeting
time.
only.
You mean your time in the classroom is limited? So,
And because we have to be adapted with the situation, But I really like to use this method. And then can we manage it ideally with the many steps of task-based learning?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Maybe we should bring that to the main room later too. But the danger to keep in mind is if you mix kind of a communicative approach with a forms-based approach, it can be easy to lose track of the communicativeness. Because we tend to fall back on what we know very well. And what we know very well is how to teach grammar step by step, right? And how to assess it too. So if you're mainly teaching grammar and then you do a communicative task only, it's possible to do, but the danger is that then you're going to, for example, give your students a quiz that's based more on language forms than looking at the outcome of the task. And if you do that, you lose the benefit of TBLT, right? And I think that's the danger, really.
Okay, get it.
So it's still possible to have it in short time, but we have to make some adjustment then. Marcos.
You have to keep the principles in mind, because it's easy to lose touch of it. This might be a good question to go back to the main room, actually, because I'm sure many people have this this problem. Should we do it now? It's been 4.5.
All right. Okay. Yeah. We're still waiting for other participants.
Some are still coming back, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe they have a very good discussion in the breakout rooms.
I hope so. It's always difficult to you know, if you don't know each other and you're randomly in a room to start chatting.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to move ahead to the next section. I'm worried about time here, and I want to make sure I hit the other very important point, which has to do with assessment.
It's okay.
Is that okay? Is everybody back here now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ready?
All right. So yeah, I'm going to do something that I don't like doing as a teacher. I don't like doing a task and then moving on to the next thing without giving feedback on it. But I am worried a little bit about that we'll run out of time. So I'm going to share my screen again. And we're back to this example. I hope some of you came up with some great ideas for themes. I would really love to hear them, but I don't think we have that luxury at the moment. Maybe in a Q&A session afterwards. But a very good question came up from Ami.
Yeah, Bu Ami.
Ami Syamsia. Is that how you pronounce it? Sorry.
Wow, that's excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Her question is, if you have a limited time to do TBLT within the context of all the other things that we have to do in the classroom, is it possible to do? And that's a very good question, because not everyone has the luxury of doing this long curriculum like this. And that's a very good question. And yes, the answer is yes. You can do kind of a contained task and then do other stuff at as well with the rest of the time. But there's a big danger inherent there, and that danger has to do with losing track of the principles of TBLT. So, for example, if you're teaching in a more sort of structured language-based way, language forms-based way, and then you're asking your students to just stop thinking that way and let's think about it in a different way for a moment. and then you do a communicative task. The danger there is that you're going to revert back to the other way of doing things, because that's what we know very well, right? And when you do a task, you don't want, for example, to make your assessment based on other criteria. And actually, this leads us into assessment. I think assessment becomes really, really important, because this is a quote from Peter Skian, who's also a very important figure in task-based learning. And he says that if task-based approaches to teaching are not complemented by task-based approaches to testing, then they may come under threat. So for example, if testing is based on linguistic units and formats are used which are not communicative in nature, then the teaching gravitates back to this style. And that's the danger that can happen if you're doing a lot of language-focused work and then just a little bit of communicative work. Because what do you do after you do the task? Are you going to be assessing it based on outcomes, or are you going to be tying it to the curriculum and assessing it based on the grammar items that you've been teaching? Because if you do the latter, then this is what happens. You kind of gravitate back towards kind of traditional assessment. Maybe I don't want to bring an analogy that has to do with something that you might not be familiar with, but if some of you are familiar with the healthcare debate in the United States over the last number of years, then I think there's a good analogy there. What happened with President Barack Obama, for example, is Barack Obama wanted to bring a healthcare system that was for everybody, kind of a one-payer system, if you will, right? Like many countries have. Now, Barack Obama couldn't do this completely, so they did something that was kind of like a half model, right? And it was better than what had been there before, but it's not as good as the whole thing, which is the single payer system. And what happened was then Trump and the Republicans started to chip away and to cut and destroy that kind of healthcare system that Barack Obama created, right? In other words, it started reverting back to what had been there before. The other model, which was suggested by people like Bernie Sanders, was to create this whole system that's completely different. And ideologically, it's a one-payer system, right? Socialism, so to speak, right? Which is more difficult to implement, but once you implement, it's more stable. It doesn't revert back, right? So sorry if that's too obscure of an analogy, but it's the same thing here. If you do something that's full TBLT, then the danger that you'll go back to the traditional model becomes lessened. If you do something that's half and half, it's still better than not doing it at all, but the danger is that it's slowly going to go back to that original model and you'll lose the benefit of TBLT. This is why I don't support a kind of task-supported approach, and why I believe that a strong TBLT approach is important. It doesn't mean that teaching grammar is not also important. It just means that the two have to be kind of separated as much as possible so that you don't lose sight of the principle of TBLT. This is what Peter Skian is talking about with assessment. And so basically what he's saying is that task-based tests need to become commonplace so that teachers can do a little bit of task-based teaching in the classroom and a little bit of other kinds of teaching in the classroom, and the two don't get mixed up together. And it's difficult to do. Task-based test assessment is a little bit difficult to do because it's not as intuitive as giving a grammar quiz. Giving a grammar quiz, we all pretty much understand how to do it. All teachers know how to do that pretty well. What we don't know how to do is to assess by real world outcomes. And so I want to show you another model which allows you to do that. Now, when you want to assess a task performance, you usually do something like this, I would imagine. This kind of rubric is very commonplace right now. teachers, when you're judging, for example, like speeches and things like that, presentations, teachers often have a kind of model like this, where they look at all these discrete items. You know, did the introduction do something? Was the theme clear? Were there key points stressed? Is it neatly arranged? A lot of items that you have to keep in mind as you're grading the student and you're creating a kind of rubric. At the end, this particular rubric, you've got a score out of 100. It's a very complex way of grading, and it's not very intuitive at all from a task-based perspective. Another thing that is done, let me erase this here. This is another example of the same kind of thing, which is, again, a rubric over here. And this one includes a lot of points to consider in scoring. You can imagine that if you're going to use a rubric like this in the classroom, it would be very cumbersome. It will take you a lot of preparation time, and it's not really very intuitive how to do it in smaller tasks, right? For a big task, you might have the luxury to do something like this, a big presentation. But what about smaller presentations? How do you judge them in the classroom? This kind of approach is not really very intuitive. It's very cumbersome, very difficult to do. And so it's at this point that teachers tend to revert back to a more traditional way of judging, right? A teacher might look at this and go, oh, geez, there's no way I'm going to do all of that. Okay, I'll just give a grammar quiz and see if they're using the right vocabulary. And that's what tends to happen far more often than it should. And that's a real danger. And it's a real problem with TBLT. It's a problem because we don't know how to progress. It's either this or a vocabulary grammar test. So what can we do? Well, I think the solution is, again, to focus on outcome, focus on task outcome. If we can do that, then it solves a lot of problems for us. We have, let me open the chat. I feel like I'm forgetting. Okay. Here we go. So to do task-based assessment, there is one very important thing you need to do first, and that's to decide yes or no if the task outcome is achieved. If you don't do this first, there's a real danger that you'll revert back to the kind of grammar focus, and you'll be taking into account criteria that maybe are less important from a communicative point of view. And then secondarily, the second step is how well is it achieved? And that second step is not too different from this kind of approach here. So what I'm suggesting is not too different. It's just I'm saying you can leave this stuff second. The first thing you need to do is the task outcome achieved. And the way to do that, this is a rubric that I've been developing to do just that. It allows the teacher to judge any kind of task. That's why I call it a universal rubric. You can use this for speaking tasks or writing tasks or listening tasks. As long as you follow these steps in preparation, right? So to prepare, you have to, of course, define what your task is. So I've put some examples here. So write a party invitation could be an example task. Order a pizza by telephone, or write a recipe, or make a hotel reservation online, and so on, right? So in preparation, the teacher would define the task quite clearly on this line. And they would also define the outcome. So what's the functional, real world-like outcome that's expected? So for example, if the task is to write a recipe, then the outcome would be someone could follow this recipe to prepare the dish. Okay? That's the real world outcome of this task. This is the main question. Okay? This is the main question that is answered here. Okay. Can someone follow this recipe to fully prepare the dish? Yes or no? It's a yes or no question. It doesn't matter how good the English is. It doesn't matter how accurate. If it's not something that can be followed as a recipe, then it's a no. Okay? And so you've put that very important distinction right at the front. And the parameters, of course, are important for students because they are the rules of how to do the task. And that goes to things like open or closed, focused or unfocused. But in this case, so again, talking about a recipe, the parameters could be have a list of ingredients, maybe have a certain number of steps that have to be followed. Or if it's a writing task, it would be how long is it? A full page, 300 words, 1,000 words, and so on. These are important parameters to set because the student needs to know what they are. And I'll show you here an example that I have done, and then I'll show you an example of the tasks that students did based on it. So here's that elevator pitch task that I mentioned before. So the task is to make an elevator pitch, to give an elevator pitch. The outcome will be that the student has pitched, that the student has pitched a clear, easy to understand idea that is persuasive, okay? That's the outcome, not linguistic in nature, you'll note, right? I'm not requiring the student to use any particular kind of language. I'm just saying it has to be clear, easy to understand, descriptive, and so on. It has to be a maximum of 1 minute, and it must clearly explain the function, and you may use appropriate props, okay? Now, an appropriate prop for an elevator pitch could be something like a piece of paper where you hold up the piece of paper and say, here's my idea, right? An inappropriate prop would be something that you wouldn't be able to use in that kind of situation. So this is the universal rubric. Now, I'm going to show you an example, okay? And I want to show you how easy it is, number one, and I want to show you as well, I hope, how reliable it is to assess in this way. So I'm going to show you a task performance. A student is going to give an elevator pitch on video. You're going to watch it, and you're going to decide, first of all, yes or no, okay? Does the student achieve the task? Yes or no, okay? And then if the student does achieve the task, you're going to think about how well was it achieved, and then you're going to choose a number from 6 to 10, okay? Give the student a score, okay? So you're going to do two things, yes or no, and then if yes, you're going to choose a number here, okay? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, okay? If it's no, then you don't have to choose a number. If it's no, then that means the student has not accomplished the task appropriately enough, which means that you would give feedback and the student would then have an opportunity to do the task again, okay? Now, this is something you could use in the classroom to make your assessment task-based. Let me give you the example then. I'm going to forward to the next slide, and then we will listen to a 1-minute video, okay? While you're listening, think about these two items, yes or no, and then how good. We'll come back to that in a minute. After the video, I'm going to ask you to put your answer in the chat, okay? So please get ready. And here we go. Nope. Here we go. If there's a problem with sound, can you let me know, Intan?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the sound should be okay. I'm going to play.
I think so. It should be okay.
Hello, I'm going to talk about my new product idea. This product will help many people who don't sleep immediately.
Okay, so sorry, I'll just start again because that cut at the beginning a little bit.
Hello, I'm going to talk about my new product idea. This product will help many people who don't sleep immediately. I think many people has a trouble recently that they can't sleep immediately because their work and their phone. So I want to solve
The
this
sound is a little
problem.
bit bouncing
So
back.
I came up with this idea.
Sorry, the sound is not working?
Bouncing back to us, echoing.
Echoing.
Yeah, mine is good as well. Bu Ami, maybe you can set up the gadget like in a more stable internet connection, maybe.
Are you speaking to me or to the?
No, to Bu Ami, to Bu Ami.
Okay, sure, Bu Intan. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll set it up.
All right, okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to continue. Whoops.
Yeah.
Here we go.
That I called Good Night Box. Good Night Box can let people fall asleep. So prepare your phone, and this is a Good Night Box. And how to use this? Good Night Box connect into this area. Phone has a hole in this area, and gas comes from here. The gas can make people sleep. So this is easy. What do you think of this idea?
Okay, so that's it. That's the elevator pitch for this idea. Okay, I'm not going to discuss the idea yet because part of the criteria we're looking for is whether it's clear. Okay, now of course, except for technical problems, if you couldn't understand because of technical problems, then please don't answer. But if you could understand, if you could hear clearly, then what do you think? Is it yes or no? Does the student accomplish the task? Please put just yes or no in the chat. And maybe try not to watch what everyone else is writing because we don't want to have a kind of radar, reliability issue. But I think it's, yeah, I think I very rarely have anybody say no to this particular performance, right? So I think it's quite clear, it's yes, okay? So the student accomplished the task. Now, how well is the outcome achieved? Now, this is the part that can lead a little bit to subjectivity, right? So try not to watch what's on the chat. Just put a number, but don't read what the other numbers are before you put your number. But what do you think? Is it a 6, a 7, an 8, or a 9, or a 10? In other words, how good is it? Don't overthink it, and don't read the chat. Just put a number. Nobody has a different score, or are people being hesitant to be the one who has a different score? That's okay, but 8 seems to be a strong answer. Yeah, let me see here, because he's fluent enough, although he has a strong Japanese accent. Yeah, exactly. So Intan is already giving feedback, right? Which would be the next
okay.
the next part of this.
Sorry.
Okay, good. No, that's excellent. So basically, I have done this. In fact, here I'll show you my feedback.
Hello.
Which is here. Okay, this was my actual feedback that I gave to the student, and what has happened when I have actually shown this particular video many times before in other presentations, and the score is always somewhere in here. This group seems to have been very strong on the 8, but I get pretty much a half and half between 7 and 8. So I would say that the most typical score is actually 7.5 for this student. But this group has been a little bit towards the 8. Of course, there's always going to be some level of subjectivity in this kind of thing. But the important thing I think to keep in mind here is that it's far more reliable, it's far less subjective than we perhaps would think going in. There's a tendency for teachers to think that this kind of holistic assessment is going to be very, very subjective. But actually, if you study the range of scores that people give, it's actually quite good. It's actually quite reliable, even without any training, and so this is a way that you can focus on the important factors of task outcome when you do TBLT without reverting back to language items, right? So again, remember, this is an alternative to that other way of looking at it. Let me see if I can find the right slide here. Remember that this is an alternative to the other kind of assessment, which is either focus on language, like a grammar approach, or to have a kind of rubric like this, right? So the alternative is do this for scoring, or do something like this, which is inherently simpler. And it's frankly the kind of thing that you want to do if you're doing minor tasks. Something like this may be a little bit more appropriate if you're doing a big presentation at the end of the term or something like that. But you can't do this for every single task in the classroom. It's not very intuitive. What you can do, however, is start from something like this and use perhaps some of these items here as a way to give feedback to the other way of doing things. Using the other rubric, you can use these kinds of descriptors as a way of giving feedback. This annotation feature on Zoom is really difficult to use. Here we go. And so your feedback can be based on that, right? And what you want to do in the case that the student doesn't succeed, thank you, Intan. In the case that the student doesn't succeed, then what you do is have them do it again by checking that box. Now, so tasks have real world like outcomes and are assessed based on those outcomes. I think hopefully that model shows you how to do that in a way that's intuitive and easy to do in the classroom. The problem still remains a little bit. The kind of criticism is by what criteria can we judge the adequacy of the outcome? And that's where I showed this as a possible example. Does anyone have any other suggestions that you could use for feedback or for a way of coming up with a list of criteria that you could use in this kind of situation? I know we're getting, it's already been 2 hours, right? So we've got 8 minutes, Intan, is that correct?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, I won't wait for an answer. I'll provide it for you. But one thing that you can do that will help you with feedback and is using can-do statements and referring to a language descriptor system like the Common European Framework. The language benchmarks from Canada is the one that I like. And in fact, I've put in an example into that Google Drive that I've shared with you. And the other one is the ACTFL, which is the American version. It's actually the oldest, but it's been renewed recently. I'm not as familiar with the ACTFL as I am with the other two. But that's something that you can use for the feedback portion of the assessment, especially if you're doing something that has to be graded and sequenced. Another option would be something like borrowing from pragmatics a little bit. I've created this sort of 3-point model, which is, excuse me, not so difficult to keep in your mind. It's based on something called Grice's maxims, which some of you may be familiar with. There are actually 4 maxims, but I've reduced it to 3 to make it even simpler for the assessor. But basically, Grice's maxims have to do with successful communication, a cooperative principle in conversation. And so maxim number 1 is quantity, which basically comes down to how much information you're giving, is it too much or is it too little? Okay. In the context of a task, it could be, is it too long or too short, right? Quality or relation are the two I've put together. Have to do with relevancy of the information and how good it is. And so in other words, that goes to the content of the performance. And manner, I've adapted perhaps heavily, but I use manner to mean the form or the mode of formality. So in other words, in a speaking context, you could think of something like how casual or polite is it? Is it appropriate to the context? And these are not correct or incorrect. They're just a kind of measure. Depending on the context, depending on the task, some, may be more or less in any of these three, but it gives you a kind of benchmark that you can use to decide whether it's a yes or no decision at the beginning. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes. I'm going to stop here because I was going to show you another example, but this is going to take too long. So I'm going to stop here and then ask if there are any questions at the end. I'm sorry, 2 hours is a long, long time. My brain is kind of mushy now too.
No, you did great. We have a very dense and hands-on materials today about TBLT. And this is very practical so that we can apply this. We can't wait to apply this in our class.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad it's practical. Practical is very important.
Indeed, indeed. All right, so maybe I will open one question if there are some participants who want to ask. Bapak Ibu, you may raise your hands maybe, so that if you want to ask a question, we still have one more. Okay. So I think it's pretty clear, Marcos, for the explanation about TBLT. So that as a conclusion, that TBLT is a possible teaching method and teaching approach that we can do. We may try in our class, and it's good that Marcos have already shared the materials of the PPT today in the drive, and also how the preview from the planning, the type of tasks, and then how to assess the students when doing task-based language teaching. This is very inspiring, Marcos. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, I look, if any of you are coming to my plenary in 2 days, it will only be 30 minutes, right? So hopefully it'll be some of this, but condensed.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Marcos, would you like to stop your screen for a while?
Sure.
Okay.
Please email me if you have any questions. That my email has been up there.
Yeah, so Bapak Ibu, you can email Marcos if you want to have more discussion about TBLT, especially how to apply that in your school or in your classroom. Okay, so Bapak Ibu, as a reminder, please fill in the attendance form so that we can have your names for the certificates. And do not forget, for tomorrow is our first day conference. We are going to have Dr. Willy Renandia and Dr. Andi Boon for the day one. And then day two, we are going to have Marcos again with Dr. Sol and also Dr. Maharsi. So don't forget to attend the next 2 days for our conference, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so before we end our workshop today, we would like to have a photo session. Yeah, since this is during the pandemic, so we have photo session in boxes. So would you mind to open your camera, ladies and gentlemen, so that share your best smile. Okay, so for the first screen, so we have 5 screens, Marcos. Okay, many people are interested in TBLT. All right, 1, 2, 3. Okay, for the second slide, next slide, number 2. Okay, slide 3. Okay, wow, so many slides. Slide 4. And the last one, slide 5. Okay, all right. We thank you again, Marcos, for a very beneficial TBLT insight today. We do hope that we can meet again in the second day of our conference with Marcos Benevides. Okay, thank you, Bapak Ibu. Thank you, Marcos.
Thank
See you
you.
next
Thank you
time.
very much.
Okay, bye everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.